The Keurig in the corner of the 31st floor kitchenette made the same grinding noise it had made every morning for the past 18 months, and I'd stopped filing maintenance requests about it, somewhere around month 3. Some things you just learn to work around. I'd learned to work around a lot of things since joining Hargreaves Capital as executive assistant to its managing partner. The early starts, the Sunday evening emails, the way certain clients called me sweetheart, until I'd trained them out of it with enough cold professionalism that they eventually forgot they'd ever tried. I didn't mind the work. That's the honest truth of it. I liked the precision required, the way a perfectly managed calendar felt like architecture, each block of time load-bearing, nothing wasted. I liked knowing that when Dominic Hargreaves walked into a boardroom, every document he needed was already there, every conflict already anticipated, every stakeholder already softened by the right preliminary conversation. 2 years, 730 days, give or take, of arriving at 7:30, of preparing his morning briefing with the same methodical care, of becoming invisible in exactly the right ways. His office sat behind a wall of frosted glass at the end of the floor, and my desk faced the elevator bank, positioned so I could intercept anyone who approached before they disturbed whatever he was building in there. I'd learned the rhythms of the place the way you learn the layout of a house you've lived in long enough to navigate in the dark. Gallagher. His voice came through the phone line, not the intercom. He preferred the phone, said intercoms felt like announcing things. The particular flatness in his tone meant he'd been in his head since before I arrived. The Brennan file. Where are we? It wasn't a question. Dominic Hargreaves didn't ask questions so much as issue invitations to demonstrate competence. Restructured and on your desk. Left side, flagged in blue. I've noted the 3 valuation discrepancies you'll want addressed before Thursday's call. I kept my voice level. The revised projections are more conservative than their team will like. A pause. You caught the Q3 anomaly. It's not subtle once you know what to look for. Another pause, longer. Come in. I gathered my notepad and the Brennan summary, smoothed the front of my gray trousers. Professional, unobtrusive, the kind of outfit that communicated competence without demanding attention, and pushed through the glass door. His office was all north-facing windows, and the particular gray-white light of a Toronto morning in November. Dominic stood at the credenza with his back to me, the way he always stood when he was working through something, as if the city below provided the right kind of neutral backdrop for his thinking. He was 38, though people consistently guessed older, because there was a quality of deliberateness to him that usually took men longer to develop. Dark suit. No tie. He'd stopped wearing them 2 years ago, and I suspected no one had dared comment. Dark hair silvering at the temples in a way that seemed less like aging and less like a choice. Walk me through your read on Brennan, he said without turning. I did. He listened without interrupting, which was either a good sign or a sign he was waiting to identify exactly where I'd gone wrong. By the time I finished, he'd turned to face me, and the quality of his attention, focused, assessing, not unkind, was something I'd stopped finding intimidating around month 4. The corrected model's cleaner than what their own analysts produced, he said. Their analysts are working with incomplete assumptions. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly. Something adjacent. Leave the flag on the Q3 section. I want Brennan's CFO to see it before I do. I nodded, turned to go. Zoe. He used my first name rarely enough that it always caught me slightly off guard. The package that arrived this morning. Front desk logged it to you. My hand stilled on the door frame. I hadn't ordered anything to the office. I'm not expecting anything. Apparently someone is expecting you to be expecting something. His tone was carefully even. Flowers. Front desk says they're considerable. I didn't know what to do with that, so I did what I always did when I didn't know what to do with something. I kept my face neutral and said I'd handle it, and went back to my desk, where the Brennan file suddenly felt less urgent than the question of who would send me flowers at my place of work. My colleague Mara from the floor below appeared at my elbow at 11:15 with the particular energy of someone who has been waiting all morning to deliver information. Okay, so I saw them, she said without preamble, dropping into the chair across from my desk. Zoe, there are at least 4 dozen. White peonies, which are not cheap in November. I would like you to know. And there's no card in the front. Front desk checked. There has to be a card. There's a card in the arrangement itself. I may have looked. She had the grace to appear slightly sheepish. It says for the woman who makes the impossible look effortless. No signature, just an initial. GG. I turned the letter over in my mind and came up with nothing. My theory, Mara said, lowering her voice with the precision of someone who has been developing this theory for several hours, is that it's from upstairs. She tilted her head toward Dominic's office. Mara, I've seen how he's my employer, and he would sooner send a strongly worded memo than flowers. That's not who he is. She looked unconvinced but let it drop, and I spent the rest of the morning not thinking about the flowers, and therefore thinking about nothing else. The afternoon had an unusual quality to it. Dominic called me in twice for things that could have been handled by email, and both times I felt the weight of his attention in a way that felt different from the usual professional calibration. When his 2 o'clock arrived and I showed the client in, I caught Dominic's eyes tracking toward the window before he collected himself and turned to greet them. At 5 o'clock, his chief of security, a quiet man named Reed, who communicated largely through the economy of his expressions, appeared at my desk. Mr. Hargreaves would like the flowers transferred to your car, Reed said. He'll arrange a courier if you don't have one. They can stay at the front desk. I'm sure the building appreciates the ambiance. Reed's expression did not change, which was how I knew this was not optional. He was specific. I gathered my coat and my bag, took the elevator to the ground floor lobby, and found the arrangement waiting at the security desk. Mara had not been exaggerating. 4 dozen white peonies, ranunculus tucked between them, the whole thing wrapped in ivory paper and dark green ribbon. Expensive didn't cover it. Considered was the word I kept returning to. Dominic came through the private elevator as I was reaching for the arrangement. He crossed the lobby in the way he always moved, like the room had been arranged for his passage, and stopped in front of the flowers with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, something tighter. Dispose of them, he said quietly enough that only I and the nearest security guard heard. The guard looked uncertain. Sir, they're addressed to Miss Gallagher. I heard what I said. Heat climbed up the back of my neck. I set my bag down carefully and turned to face him. With respect, Mr. Hargreaves. My voice was steady, which I was grateful for. They were sent to me. If anyone's disposing of anything, that's my decision to make. He turned to look at me, and the expression on his face was something I didn't have a word for yet. Nothing I'd seen in 2 years of daily proximity. It wasn't professional. It wasn't the controlled distance he maintained with everyone. It was raw in a way that didn't suit him, didn't fit the composed architecture of who he was at work. You want to keep flowers from a stranger you can't identify. I want to make decisions about my own belongings. I took 1 step toward him, aware of every person in the lobby watching this exchange. And I want to understand why you care. The silence between us had weight. He moved closer, not aggressively but deliberately, the way he did everything, until I had to tilt my chin slightly to hold his gaze. He smelled of cedar and something darker. He'd been wearing the same cologne for 2 years, and I'd never let myself notice before now. Because your safety is a professional responsibility, he said, his voice very low. Because anonymous deliveries sent to this building go through proper vetting protocols. Because I don't know who sent those, and that is a problem. That's not all this is. The words were out before I'd decided to say them. His jaw tightened. For 1 second, just one, I thought he might actually say what was behind his eyes. Instead, he stepped back, composure reassembling like a wall being built in real time. Reed, have the flowers sent to Ms. Gallagher's address and run a full trace on the florist order. I want originating payment information by morning. He turned and walked toward the main exit, adding without looking back, and Zoe, take the company car. I'd stopped arguing about the company car 6 months ago. I rode home with 4 dozen peonies filling the back seat with a scent that was going to be in my coat for a week. My apartment was in the annex, a 1-bedroom I'd made livable with enough plants and decent second-hand furniture. The flowers looked surreal on my kitchen table, like something from a different version of my life had wandered in through the wrong door. The card was still in the arrangement. I read it again. For the woman who makes the impossible look effortless. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I hope you received them safely. I've been meaning to introduce myself for some time. I thought this was a better opening than most. G. A second message 30 seconds later. I'd love to take you to dinner. Friday, if you're free. I'll make a reservation somewhere worth your time. I stared at both messages. This was not a coworker with a crush. This was deliberate, informed, someone who knew my workplace, who could afford to spend several $100s on flowers as an opening move, who was confident enough to follow up within the same evening. My phone rang, Dominic's direct line, the one he gave to 6 people in the world. Have you received any other communication? Not a question. Text messages. 2 of them. Signed G. Forward them to me. Don't respond. Don't delete. A pause and then something shifted in his voice. The professional register dropped by a fraction. Lock your door. I'm sending Reed to your street. That's not. It is necessary, please. The word landed differently than I expected. Dominic Hargreaves did not say please. I'll explain everything tomorrow. Just do this one thing. He ended the call before I could argue. I forwarded the messages and checked my door. Already locked. Deadbolt turned, the way I always left it. Then I stood in my kitchen with flowers that didn't belong to my life, and the uneasy feeling that whatever I'd stepped into tonight wasn't about flowers at all. I arrived at 7:30 the next morning, the same as always. The lobby had 2 additional security personnel whose positions looked less like routine coverage and more like deliberate placement. Reed was waiting at the elevator. Mr. Hargreaves is in the East Conference Room, he said. He's been here since 5. The East Conference Room was used for situations that required absolute discretion. I'd been inside it 4 times in 2 years. Dominic was standing at the windows when I entered, hands clasped behind his back, and the tension in his shoulders told me he hadn't slept. Close the door. I did. The flowers were sent by a man named Graham Colt. He turned. The shadows beneath his eyes confirmed it. He'd been awake most of the night. Does that name mean anything to you? No. His father is Douglas Colt. They run private equity operations out of Calgary and Vancouver. Legitimate on the surface, with a secondary layer of activity that is considerably less so. He moved to the table, which held a folder I hadn't seen him prepare. Douglas and I had a significant professional conflict 4 years ago. He was running investment vehicles that were, at minimum, misleading to their clients, and at maximum, structured specifically to obscure the movement of capital from sources I didn't want my firm associated with. I uncovered this during due diligence on a proposed partnership. You pulled out of the deal. I pulled out, reported my concerns to the appropriate regulatory bodies, and made certain that several institutional investors who were about to commit significant capital heard what I'd found. His jaw was tight. Douglas Colt lost those investors. He lost 2 years of positioning. He blamed me for what were, in fact, the natural consequences of his own decisions. And his son has been sending me flowers because... I stopped. The shape of it clarified. Because I process your sensitive deal documentation. Because I have access to your calendar, your communications, your relationships with clients. Graham Colt has been in Toronto for approximately 4 months. In that time, he's been at the same coffee shop you go to on Tuesday mornings twice. He attended a gallery opening in Yorkville that you volunteered at in September. He's had lunch at the same Queen Street restaurant where you and Mara eat on alternating Fridays. Dominic's voice was completely flat. Once is coincidence. 4 months of it is not. Cold moved through me slowly. How long have you known? Since September, when Reed flagged a pattern in the surveillance footage from the gallery event. Graham asked about you. Too many questions, framed too casually, to a volunteer coordinator who didn't know enough to be cautious. He held my gaze. I've been monitoring his movements since then. You've been monitoring mine as well. I've been protecting you. A muscle in his jaw moved. There is a difference, Zoe. Though I recognize how it appears, and I'm not asking you to feel comfortable with it. That surprised me enough that I had to pause. Dominic Hargreaves did not typically acknowledge how things appeared. What does he want? The same thing his father has wanted, since I dismantled his deal 4 years ago. Dominic opened the folder, spreading photographs across the table. Graham at the coffee shop on College Street. Graham across the street from my building. Graham in the background of a photograph I recognized. The gallery opening. Me laughing with another volunteer. Him 12 feet behind us. Leverage. Information that could be used to damage my firm's current positioning. or compromising knowledge that would force a negotiation he couldn't otherwise access. And he thinks I'm the path to that. You're someone he's assessed as potentially dissatisfied, someone who has access and proximity without the protective instincts of someone who's been in this world longer. He paused. He's wrong about the dissatisfied part. He may have badly underestimated the rest. What are you asking me to do? He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had gone careful. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm informing you of a situation that directly affects your safety. What I intend to do is, you were going to handle it without telling me. I was hoping to resolve it before it reached you. It's already reached me. It was on my kitchen table last night. I set my notebook down, so tell me the rest of it. The real plan, not the version where I'm kept to the side for my own protection. He looked at me for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, the same quality I'd seen in the lobby, that brief unguarded fraction. Graham will reach out again. Probably today, given that you didn't respond last night. He'll want to meet, somewhere he controls, somewhere he can begin the actual approach. Feeling out whether you're receptive, whether you have grievances, whether you can be cultivated. Dominic's voice was precise, analytical, the voice of a man who had run through every scenario while the rest of the city slept. If you were willing, and I want to be completely clear that you are not obligated, you could meet him, in a public place of your choosing, with Reed nearby and a full recording setup. Let him make his pitch. Let him implicate himself explicitly. We take that to the OSC, the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit, and the journalist at the Globe, who has been trying to build a story on Douglas Colt's investment practices for 2 years. You want to hand him over to a journalist and regulators, instead of handling it privately. I want him and his father to face actual consequences, rather than a quiet resolution that lets them recalibrate and try again. Something in his expression hardened. Douglas Colt's investment vehicles hurt ordinary people, Zoe. Retail investors who put their savings into products they were told were conservative. When the structures unwound, those people lost money they couldn't afford to lose. I could make Graham Colt go away quietly. What I can't do is let them rebuild and do it again to a different set of people. I thought about that, about the specific texture of what he'd just told me, that his motivations weren't just territorial, weren't just about protecting his own position. About the fact that he'd been watching Graham watch me for 4 months and hadn't turned it into a unilateral action. I have conditions, I said. That caught him off guard. I could tell because he blinked, once, which for Dominic Hargreaves was the equivalent of a physical recoil. Condition. If I do this, I want full information. Everything you know, everything your team finds in real time. No managed disclosure. No need to know rationing. I held his gaze. And when this is over, we have a real conversation. About what you said in the lobby last night. What you almost said. About what this actually is. The silence went long enough that I heard the ventilation system cycling. Agreed, he said finally. Both conditions. It was a strange 10 days. Reed briefed me on Graham Colt's known associates and habits. I learned where he'd gone to school, Upper Canada College, then Queen's, the kind of background that produced a specific type of confidence in men who'd been told since childhood that they were the intended inheritors of things. Dominic watched the preparations with the controlled tension of someone running electrical current through very still hands. On the third night, I found him alone in the conference room at 9:15, the photographs still spread across the table. You could find another way, he said from the doorway before I could speak. I've been reconsidering. There are legal mechanisms that don't require you to be in a room with him. They take longer and they're less clean. I sat across from the photographs. This ends it. This puts you in a room with a man who sees you as a means to an end. Then it's a good thing I know that going in and he doesn't. He came into the room and closed the door, stood on the other side of the table. You're not afraid. I'm a little afraid. That's different from being unable to proceed. Zoe. My name in his mouth, low and careful. Tell me why you're doing this. The real reason. Not the strategic analysis. I looked at him across the spread of surveillance photographs, the paper evidence of a man who'd been circling me for months, and I thought about the 2 years of careful professional distance, and the moment in the lobby when that distance had cracked open. Because it's the right thing to do for people who lost money they couldn't afford to lose. I said. And because somewhere in the last 2 years, your firm's work became something I care about. Not because you pay me, because I believe in how you do it. I held his gaze. And because you said I mattered more than was probably wise, and I'd like to find out what that means on the other side of this. His hands were flat on the table. The city hummed 31 floors below us. I've been wanting to say something since approximately month 6, he said, each word placed like it had weight. When you rewrote the Carlisle client brief while I was mid-call with their board, and had a better version waiting when I disconnected. You thought I was in the other room. You didn't do it to be seen. That's not. You drink your tea with the bag left in too long because you forget it there. You keep 3 different colored pens in your coat pocket and unconsciously sort them by task. You've never once asked me to acknowledge something publicly that you'd done, but you will push back on a bad decision until I either justify it or change my mind, and you do it without making it about you. He moved around the table slowly, as if giving me time to step back. I didn't. You asked me once, early on, why I'd kept the same assistant longer than most partners in this industry. I told you it was because you were efficient. I remember. That was true and also not the whole truth. He stopped an arm's length away. The whole truth is that you are the only person in this building who treats my decisions as things that can be wrong. Everyone else accounts for my authority before they account for the facts. You account for the facts first. I find that. He paused, something moving behind his eyes. I find it necessary, in a way I didn't anticipate and haven't known what to do with. I kissed him. Not planned, not calculated. The same way you close a window that's been open too long in November. Just direct, decisive action. He went still for one breath, and then his hands came up to frame my face with a gentleness that I hadn't expected from someone who ran everything else in his life with such control, and he kissed me back with 2 years of precision, finally finding somewhere to go. When we stepped back, both slightly unsteady, he rested his forehead against mine. This is complicated. Yes, there are power dynamics. I know what they are. I'm 13 years older than you. I'm aware of how subtraction works, Dominic. A sound came out of him that might have been a laugh. Genuine. Brief, unguarded, in a way I'd never heard from him before. Then his expression settled into something quieter, something that looked like relief mixed with the particular brand of fear, belonging to people who've learned that wanting things makes them vulnerable. Friday, he said. Graham will send you a follow-up today. Respond on Friday, suggest a lunch location you choose. We'll have Reed in position, full coverage, and I will be. He paused. I will be somewhere in the vicinity, doing my best to be rational. I smiled. I'll hold you to the rational part. Don't, he said simply. If something goes wrong, rationality is not the first thing I'll reach for. Friday lunch was at a restaurant on King Street that I'd chosen specifically because it was the kind of place where the tables were far enough apart for privacy, but the sight lines from the bar were clean. Reed was at the bar. 2 members of Dominic's legal team were at a table by the window. Graham Colt was already seated when I arrived. He was handsome in the way of men who'd been told so since they were young and had stopped questioning it. Suit that cost more than my monthly rent. Easy, practiced smile. He stood as I approached and extended his hand with the smooth confidence of someone who'd been trained to read a room and use what he found there. Zoe, thank you for coming. I was starting to think the flowers had been too forward. They were forward, I said, settling into my seat. I'm still not certain why I'm here. Curiosity, he said. And possibly because a woman like you gets tired of being underestimated. He was already testing. It was barely subtle. The implication that my presence here meant I agreed with his framing of my situation. I filed it away and asked for water. Tell me about yourself, I said, beyond the flowers and the initial. He did smoothly. Calgary roots, Queen's Commerce, the family firm, the expansion into Ontario markets. He made it sound like a story of ambition and momentum, which I supposed it was, with significant detail left out. You run private equity, I said. That's not so different from what Hargreaves Capital does. Different philosophy. Something shifted, barely, in his expression. Hargreaves operates conservatively, cautiously. He has the resources to be patient, which not everyone can afford. He held my gaze. Men like him can afford to be principled because the rules were written for people like him. People trying to build something from a different starting point, sometimes have to be more creative. I processed this. He was already beginning to reframe his father's conduct as entrepreneurial necessity rather than misconduct. This was the early version of the pitch, establishing ideological sympathy before getting to the ask. Creative how? I kept my voice neutral, genuinely curious. There's information that sits in firms like Hargreaves Capital that would be enormously valuable to the right people. Not proprietary. Deal structure knowledge, relationship mapping, the logic behind positioning decisions, the kind of insight that serious analysts spend years trying to reconstruct from public filings. He was watching my face carefully. Someone with your access, your intelligence, could provide that kind of context in a way that would be worth significant compensation. How significant? He named a number. $75,000, plus a monthly retainer for ongoing access. The specificity of it was almost insulting. How long he'd been thinking about this, how carefully he'd calibrated what he thought my loyalty was worth. I set down my water glass. That's a specific offer. I'm a specific kind of person. His smile was still in place, but I could see the calculation underneath it now. He'd thought this meeting was going well. You've worked for Dominic Hargreaves for 2 years. You're smart enough to know that someone with your skills should be building something of their own, not managing someone else's calendar. This is a path to that, or I said, it's corporate espionage dressed up as mentorship. A silence. The smile cooled by several degrees. I'd be careful with language like that. Why? Am I wrong about what you're describing? I'm describing a consulting arrangement. You're describing payment for confidential information about a competitor's business dealings. In Canada, that's a civil matter at minimum, and potentially a criminal one, depending on what information is exchanged. I folded my napkin and set it on the table. You've been in Toronto for 4 months. You've been at my coffee shop, my lunch spots. You sent flowers to my office and texted my personal number, and now you're offering me money for access to my employer's confidential files. I met his eyes. I'm not what you thought I was. The moment Dominic walked through the restaurant's side door was the moment Graham understood what was happening. He'd been followed by a woman I didn't recognize, who introduced herself with a title from the RCMP's Financial Crimes Division, and the particular quality of the silence that followed was the kind that doesn't have a graceful exit from. I didn't stay for the formal portion. Reed appeared at my elbow, and we walked out through the front, into November air that tasted like the lake and exhaust, and something approaching relief. Dominic was on the pavement outside. He was in his coat, no scarf, looking like someone who had been standing there for slightly longer than was comfortable and couldn't make himself care. You were in there, I said. I was at the coffee counter. Terrible angle. I could hear but not see. You said you'd be in the vicinity. I was in the vicinity. He looked at me for a moment, the controlled assessment giving way to something else. You were extraordinary. I was angry, I said. Anger is useful. Yes, he said simply. It is. We stood there on King Street with the city moving around us, and he reached out and took my hand, not dramatically, not as a statement, just quietly, the way you'd reach for something you'd been waiting to reach for, and I let him. The next months were not simple. Nothing about building something with Dominic Hargreaves was ever going to be simple. I'd understood that from the beginning, and I continued to understand it in the evenings. When I was at his Rosedale house, learning the rhythms of a life that was larger and more complicated than mine. And in the mornings when I transitioned my role at the firm to a consulting arrangement, so that the professional and personal weren't drawing from the same well. The Globe published its investigation into Douglas Colt's investment practices 8 weeks after Graham's arrest. The RCMP filing was referenced. The piece was thorough, and, in the way of thorough journalism, devastating. Several of Douglas Colt's remaining investors withdrew within the week. His legal team issued a statement. Dominic said nothing publicly and went about his work. Graham pled out. 4 months of community service and a fine that represented, I was told, a fraction of what his approach had been designed to extract. He relocated to Calgary. I heard this from Reed and thought about it for about 30 seconds before moving on. The harder conversation came in February, 4 months after the restaurant on King Street, in Dominic's kitchen on a Sunday morning, with snow coming down on the ravine behind the house. He'd been quiet in a specific way for 3 days. the kind of quiet that had a subject underneath it. "I need to tell you something," he said. He was standing at the counter with his coffee, not looking at me. "And I want to tell you before you hear it from someone who will frame it badly." I waited. "When I was 29, I made a series of decisions about a fund I was managing that were legal, but not something I'd make today. Investors weren't misled, but they weren't fully informed about fee structures, and when the fund underperformed, they had less recourse than they should have." He turned to face me. "I've spent 15 years building practices that correct for that. The regulatory cooperation, the disclosure standards we hold to voluntarily, the pro bono advisory work, all of it is, in part, a corrective. I need you to know what it's correcting for. Why are you telling me this now? Because you trusted me with your safety. Because you stood in a restaurant and held a line for values you assumed I shared, and you assumed correctly, but you deserve to know the full history of how I arrived at those values." He held my gaze steadily. "You can't make an informed choice about this, about us, without the information that would make it genuinely informed." I looked at him for a long time. At the man who'd spent years building something better than what he'd been, who'd handed me every piece of evidence against him without being asked. "Are you doing this because you're trying to give me a reason to leave?" "I'm doing this because you told me you wanted the real truth and not the managed version." A pause. Both can be true simultaneously. I set down my tea. "Dominic, I'm not going anywhere." Something in him released, not dramatically, just a quiet shift in the set of his shoulders. "You should reserve the right to change your mind. I reserve plenty of rights. That's not one I'm interested in exercising." I crossed to where he was standing and leaned against the counter beside him, close enough that our arms touched. "You told me once that you find it necessary when someone accounts for the facts before they account for your authority. I'm accounting for the facts. The facts are that you've spent 15 years building something you believe in, and I've watched you do it for 2 of them, and I'd like to keep watching." He put his arm around me, which was how he touched me in private, without ceremony, just quietly, like it had always been this way. "I'm going to tell you things," he said, "that I've never told anyone in a professional context, about decisions I've made, about compromises, not because I want absolution, but because you should know who you're with. I know who I'm with. You know the last 15 years. I want you to know all of it." "Then tell me," I said. "I'll still be here after." He did. It took most of the day, those disclosures. Some of it was harder to hear than I'd anticipated. Not because it changed my fundamental understanding of him, but because seeing the specific shape of someone's regrets is more intimate than almost anything else. He didn't minimize, didn't frame, didn't perform remorse. He just told me and let me sit with it. By the time it grew dark outside, I knew him in a way I hadn't that morning, and he looked, if I had to choose a word, like someone who had set something down that they'd been carrying a long way. We ate dinner late. We talked about things that had nothing to do with any of it. He argued with conviction about a documentary series I'd told him to watch and hadn't gotten to, and I told him he was wrong about the optimal number of plants for a kitchen. He had none. I had 6, and he said that 6 was aggressive, and I said that aggressive was a strange word for something that couldn't move. It was ordinary. Quietly, steadily ordinary, and I thought about the woman who had arrived at a 31st floor office 2 years ago, with sensible shoes and a careful calibration of presence, and how she would have found this version of Sunday evening entirely implausible. A year and a half after the flower arrangement that started everything, we were in a lawyer's office in Midtown Toronto on a Thursday afternoon, signing documents that made certain things official, in the practical, Canadian, unromantic way that most important things get made official. Not a production, just 2 people making a commitment in front of a notary, and then going to dinner at the Thai place on Bloor Street that we'd decided was the best in the city, a debate we revisited regularly. He'd proposed in November, which he said was deliberate. He wanted it to be a year exactly from the lobby, from the flowers and the cold and the thing he'd almost said. He'd done it in the kitchen of his house with no witnesses and no theater. Just the 2 of us and the question, which was less a question than a statement with a space at the end, for my answer. I'd said yes. Then I'd told him 6 plants was not aggressive, it was aspirational, and he'd said that was exactly the kind of answer he should have expected, and then he'd kissed me in a way that meant we weren't talking about plants anymore. The people in our lives registered the news with varying degrees of unsurprise. Mara said she'd known since the lobby incident and asked why it took us so long. Reed, who had once driven me home with 4 dozen peonies in the back seat, simply nodded as if the information confirmed a calculation he'd completed some time ago. What I didn't expect, what I hadn't let myself imagine clearly enough, was what it would feel like to stand in the life we'd built and look back at the thread of it. The 7:30 arrivals that had become the rhythm of my days. The moment a man I barely knew had told a security guard to dispose of flowers, and I'd understood, without having words for it yet, that he was fighting something. The 10 days of preparation, and the restaurant on King Street, and the February Sunday, with the snow on the ravine, and everything that had grown from the particular willingness we'd both found to account for the facts before accounting for anything else. Dominic said once that the best decisions he'd ever made looked, at the moment of making them, like risks he wasn't certain he could justify. I thought about that when I looked at us, at the life that had assembled itself around 2 people who'd been very careful for a very long time, and then, in a lobby on a November evening, stopped being quite so careful. I'd take that lobby over 1,000 safe, sensible, perfectly calibrated alternatives. Every single time.